All right. Well, welcome back to more discussions of the architecture of reality. I am uh, my the downstairs is almost dried out, and so I'm still out of my office for a little bit, but hopefully I'll be back in there soon, and maybe tomorrow even. So sorry for the audio quality still, but one of the things that is interesting about the I don't know what you might call it, the popular imagination about the Middle Ages, is we often think that the Middle Ages they believed in magic, and there were witches and magicians, and you had that very superstitious age. When you actually look at the literature, you in you might have uh, magicians or witches or things in what we would call fantasy literature, which they understood to be fantasy literature or fairy literature. But you don't really have popular magic. You don't have people that believe that you might come around the corner and run into a witch. You don't really get that until the very end of the Middle Ages, or what you might call maybe what you might call the end of the Renaissance, leading into the Enlightenment. So you start to get the very end of the 1400s. You start to get uh, people arguing for magic, arguing for um, the that there are all sorts of spirits that if you know the formulation that you can control and use their power for yourself or for your own ends. And especially in the 1500s, that's a really it's kind of popularly believed. So by the time you get to Shakespeare, you have Shakespeare, for example, in The Tempest, actually warning people, don't trust a magician. That don't go out and um, pay a magician to get you a potion, or don't trust a magician's promises, because there were many people at that point that really did, especially the most educated of the people. And the reason for that is because of secular humanism. And it's we wouldn't think of it this way now, because secular humanism became materialistic and mechanistic eventually, but it was material. It was non-materialistic and mechanistic first, and that was what magic required, is a a non-material mechanistic style universe. So through the Middle Ages, there was this understanding of the interconnectedness of all things. You had this understanding of a chain, not of being, but a chain of beings that went up through the heavens, and were all interconnected and exerted influence on one another. But humanity was limited by its being, by its nature, in its own abilities. Humanity couldn't control angelic or semi-angelic or demonic beings, because that was outside of the scope of our nature's power as human beings. Well, in the what happens in the Italian Renaissance is, it sort of kicks off with Dante, who really um, integrates, is probably the best way to put it. He integrates the um, the he, well he he integrates the theological understanding, the literary understanding, and the historical understanding into a kind of scholastic poetry, or a poetry that is very scholastic. So it's carefully ordered. The details are all thought through, and in a lot of ways, it's the beginnings of the roots of an integrated humanism. He's not. he's not a humanist in a technical sense, but the spirit of humanism begins there, because the technical beginning of humanism is Petrarch, who's the very next generation, overlapping generation, and he and the humanism that he's a deeply devout Christian, but his desire to recover all human works from the ancients as well as from other places, and try and bring them together and create a library, um, begins kind of a classical revival. He actually literally went and found some texts and gets them back into print. Petrarch did, but he also his desire to see human things saved uh, and human knowledge integrated through a Christian through a Christian lens, or see all knowledge integrated in its relationship to Christ, really kicks off what becomes humanism. And there's a Christian humanism that continues on down through into the Reformation. You've got guys like Erasmus and Calvin and Beza that continue the humanist tradition and are a deeply important part of the discussions of the Reformation, trying to figure out how to do things. But then you've got a secular humanism post Petrarch that you've got Machiavelli in the late 14 and the early 1500s, and then you've got Pico, Giovanni Pico, um, who's the late 15th century, that are both prominent Florentine thinkers that try to take the humanism and secularize it. And Machiavelli secularizes it in a uh, mechanistic understanding that is materialistic, and Pico has a non-materialistic mechanistic understanding, where he tries to develop an understanding of gaining magical powers to have power over the nature of things, even down to the nature of the to our own human nature. Um, this is a quote. Pico suggests that man has no specific nature at all, but creates his own nature by his acts. Right. So, and he's really the one who revives the study of ancient magical texts. And interestingly, they all say, well, the magical arts were lost because the church rejected them, and so you have basically 900 years or 1,000 years of mankind forgetting that it can do magic. And then when the Enlightenment comes along, they blame they start to say, well, that magical era of the Middle Ages where they were so superstitious. Well, actually, it's post Middle Ages that magic is revived, and all of the people doing the reviving, they blame the Middle Ages for forgetting that we could become witches and wizards and control nature. And it's a very high-minded kind of in the university system type of magical thinking. But the idea is that there's all kinds of creatures with powers, and if we know the spells, the potions, the proper time to do things, and what to say and when to say it and where to say it, that we can bind these creatures as our slaves, bind these semi-divine beings as our slaves, and then their power becomes our power by virtue of we're the ones in control of it. And so by the time you get to King James, which is and about 100 years later, he's writing a book explaining and condemning all of this magic, right? So we think, well, the Middle Ages was filled with these witch hunts, and but the reality is, it's the beginning of the Enlightenment or the post medieval age that you start to have this obsession with witches, partly because you have people actually trying to become witches and wizards, right? So it's a it's funny that the popular imagination flips it around, but that's because um, they wrote fantasy literature in the Middle Ages just like we do, and so you would have somebody get their head cut off, and then they reattach it with magic, and but there was never any idea that the your average person could just do that any more than if somebody reads Harry Potter and then they say, "Oh, I can become like that. I'm going to Hogwarts." We would think, well, no, you a screw has been loosened somewhere along the way. You can't actually really go to Hogwarts. Well, they would say the same thing about doing uh, magic. You don't have magic texts being written until that very end of the 15th century and the early part of the 16th century. So, um, but a big part of that was they started to um, that in that secular humanist movement they shifted to a mechanistic view. When you have a view of the world where it's fully integrated and everything has a nature and every nature has a place, and that means that human nature is something that we receive and it's limited in its scope and in its power. You can't shift and change your nature to become something other than what you are, because natures are given by God and received in gratitude. But when the rejection of that led to this kind of magical thinking. So we talked yesterday um, about astrology, and there when the Christians were dealing with astrological phenomenon, the influence of the planets and the way that or the sun, the moon, the constellations, the way they saw it. It was always an influence limited by nature, right? That mankind by nature has a will, and so his will and he's responsible for his will, and so any kind of determinism, astrological determinism, is rejected. And the Council of Orange rejects determinism, theological determinism, as well as any kind of determinism, Stoic philosophy, and different things. The Council of Orange had already fully dealt with it, and so but the temptation to determinism comes back in this understanding of a mechanistic universe, and so you have you eventually get the kind of physical determinists, the determinism by physics, but you start with a determinism by influence in the late 1400s, early 1500s, that captures the imagination of a lot of people. Um, but the response to determinism was always, can we come up with the magical formula that rescues us from the determinism? So and now you see people saying like, oh, we're going to hack our DNA with these methods, with this exercise and diet and whatever. And and you've got this DNA determinism with a magical thinking that is very similar to the way that they would have approached it then, and so they would say, well, look, this thing I did over here worked, and so now it's going to here's the evidence that it works, and so now we're going to develop a system around it. Well, that's that sort of thinking um, really comes into the popular consciousness in Western Europe. Um, well, in Italy, and then eventually in England, um, in the 1500s. So, uh, as we, it's important, as we look at these sorts of things, to, I mean, the way I see it, it's interesting, but I think it's also important because you begin to see your own metaphor system and the way that we easily fall into determinism. Ours tends to be more of a chemical based determinism rather than physics or um, a spiritual determinism, but a chemical based determinism where we start to the blame chemicals, um, uh, which you know chemistry. Uh, well, we, maybe we'll dive into that and but in another time. But once you see it, it's helpful because it's not that chemistry isn't true or chemicals aren't true. That the chimera of different atom structures don't actually have an influence, but it helps us resist the determinism of a chemistry-based influence system by becoming aware of it. Because it can be helpful to understand, the chemistry of your own body and the chemistry of your surroundings and the interaction. There's nothing wrong with understanding the influence, but understanding it in a Christian non-deterministic way is important, and I think seeing the way that the influences of the medievals and some of the ways that the early Enlightenment fell apart or fell into a mechanistic understanding, I think it can help.